All right, so I was sitting around thinking about some of the work I needed to get done today. Now that I'm kind of on the other side of being sick, it got worse before it got better. My voice is still not 100%, but yeah. And one of the things I need to work on is trumpet, which I have a gig where I need to be playing my horn in about 2 weeks. And basically, what I wanted to talk about, ultimately, this is going to be about why I value skills over learning individual pieces of music, which I've brought up before, but it actually made me think about this. So one of the things you need to understand about brass instruments is that they require a heavy amount of maintenance practice. It's a very physically demanding thing. If you're a guitarist, you might understand this a little bit. That if you stopped playing for a while and you had no calluses, and then suddenly you needed to play 30 minutes of music on a steel string acoustic, you'd be a little worried about your calluses and the fact that, the strings would be slipping into your fingers as you start having trouble fretting notes. Trumpet's kind of like that, but I would say it's actually worse. It's more like, you want to run a marathon, but you just took off of running for 4 weeks and just haven't run in 4 weeks. You're not going to be able to perform at that level. Physically, you're not up to that task. So yeah, you have to get the lip muscles actually have to come back, and you can't just do that overnight. That takes consistent training over time. And I bring that up to basically say, well, okay, with this thing being 2 weeks away, why am I not more concerned? Because this was just sort of my inner monologue this morning thinking about it. I'm a little concerned, but I'm not horrifically concerned. And I was thinking about it in relation to other things, because I would totally be freaking out if it were a harder guitar gig, and it was coming up and I didn't really have a good grasp on everything that I needed to do yet. For this trumpet gig, I've been given some music. I haven't even bothered to look at it, even just mentally without the horn, just look at it and figure out what's going on there. I have some descants I have to write. I haven't looked at those. And the reason is that I just know that, one, I know how to get myself back in shape on my horn, I played for, I say 25 years. I started playing around 25 years plus ago. It's a long time now. I try to not take these gigs, and it specifically is because of that amount of maintenance practice, which actually goes back to sort of that thing I was mentioning in the scales video about it's ridiculous to spend a lot of time practicing your scales at a ridiculous velocity, because that requires consistent daily maintenance, and that takes away from the time you can spend on growing in other more practical ways. That's kind of how I feel about my trumpet. For as rarely as I have to do trumpet gigs, it's not worth the daily practice and maintenance. So I try to avoid those gigs, but I got this. Yeah, I couldn't avoid this particular one for reasons. But the thing is, I know how to get back in shape, and then once I am in shape, I have all the skill. I don't need to look at these pieces of music and go, oh man, I need to see if there's anything crazy hard that I need to be stressing out about. Because I just know that I've got the chops to do that. And like I said, if it was guitar, I'd be freaking out. I'm sure most people watching this from a piano perspective, if you were told you need to have a piece of music prepared in 2 weeks and you've never seen it before, you'd probably be a little nervous. You'd be nervous that, okay, do I have the ability to learn this piece this quickly? You'd want to look at it and see, how hard is this piece? How much work am I going to need to put in to get this piece there? Are there things that are technically so difficult that I can't do that? And there's definitely a time earlier in my piano career where that thing terrified me a lot more than it does now. It still worries me, but I've gotten better enough at piano that a lot of things don't freak me out. Especially if I just know that I'm going to be comping. It's like, oh, there's going to be chords and I need to show up and play chords behind some people singing. No problem. If it's a full, written out arrangement, I'm a little more concerned. And depending on what it is, I'm way more concerned. I'm a little more concerned with organ because I'm just not there yet. I'm more concerned, depending on what it is on guitar. If you're saying, oh, you're going to be strumming chords in the key of G, that's fine. But if it's anything like actually difficult or with some really interesting chords, like I'm not there on guitar. But yeah, on trumpet, not a problem. And that's just because when I think back, I invested so much time in just all of the technical facility. I've spent so much time. Anybody who knows about brass, I've worked a lot out of the Arbin book, the Clark Technical Studies, lots of different lip flexibility books, Bylin and just all those things. The Irons book. There's tons of these technical exercise books. That is where I have put the bulk of my practice in. And granted, the thing is, like I've mentioned, with one of the advantages to sight reading for people who are from ensemble instruments, strings and winds, they reinforce their sight reading constantly by reading lots of low-level material. They just were in an ensemble where that was happening daily and it was getting reinforced, and that's something that pianists miss. The culture of piano is not built around that, and so that ends up being kind of a missing building block. But aside from that, I was learning these easier pieces, but I was focusing so much of my practice on technical stuff. Do I feel good about this upcoming gig? Because I learned, I don't know, any number of trumpet concertos or whatever repertoire. No, when I think about that stuff, I'm like, oh, those are just things that were easier because I invested in my technical facility. Oh, I can play that the Hummel trumpet concerto, and it just opens with an F major arpeggio, and it's, you're outlining all these different chords and arpeggios, and you can see the structure of that piece where it's just, I am taking all of the skills that I have from, doing technical exercises, and I'm straight up just applying them to this, and then I'm putting a little bit of musical color on it, and that's what's giving it, the polish. So, I guess that's really why I'm such a big fan of really investing in your skills, because that's the stuff that's going to make it easier. And I can really see that progression for me on piano. Why is it that I'm less nervous these days? It's because I've invested so much more in the skills that matter. Early on there was a lot more comping, and I did so much technical work. And the thing is, starting as an older adult, I remember, I'd mentioned it in the scales video, I remember struggling with certain scales and having to think back and forth between the hands for each individual finger motion. That's something that a lot of people who started when they're 5, they literally just don't remember that ever being a struggle. But yeah, I remember that being hard, and I remember having to work through that. And then, I kept running into other impediments. Being able to voice chords quickly, certain bigger chords, because I didn't have the jazz theory background when I was coming into piano, and I sort of had to teach myself the jazz theory and figure that out and then apply it in real time. And then I remember I was bad at, I could comp okay, and maybe I could play chords in my left hand and melodies in my right hand, but I really struggled with doing the thing where you're playing part of your chord underneath the melody in your right hand and still keeping up a decent accompaniment that's not just block chords, but it's actually bass line and moving stuff. That was really hard, and then I got better at that. More these days, and maybe I'd say over the last 5 years, more of my work has taken me in the direction where it's sight reading that terrifies me. I literally used to have nightmares about this all the time. These were the nightmares I'd have. I'd always have these nightmares where I'd show up somewhere, and I don't know, I'm at a church and some pianist is like, oh, by the way, you've got to play the entire service for me. Just go sight read. And terrifying. Those are terrifying dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat because that really is my fear. Yeah, I wouldn't have those nightmares now. If I was somewhere and I don't know, the pianist would drop dead and they're like, oh God, you've got to finish the rest of this church service. I'd be like, okay, cool. It might be a little rough, but yeah, we can make it happen. And there's a time that would not have been the case, but it's because I've really invested more specifically in sight reading. With piano, it is more complicated in a lot of ways because you have all the technical facility is so much deeper than it is with a wind instrument. I tend to tell people that with a wind instrument, once you learn all of your scales and arpeggios, you're 95% of the way to having everything technically in your tool set that you actually need to play music. And there's everything else is just like little details that'll help you get a little better. But like scales and arpeggios, that's almost all of it. You can play almost all of the music. But with piano, it's more complicated because you can play more than one note at a time. You've got two hands, you've got 10 fingers. There's a lot happening. But yeah, like I've invested in a lot of technical things. I've invested a lot more in the sight reading things, and the better I get at that, the less I stress about it. I notice I have these kind of recurring accompaniment jobs for like school choirs and stuff that come up kind of yearly around certain times of the year. And I have one coming up in less than a week now. And I got started real late working on this because I've just been swamped with other work. So practice-wise, I got started late. And I have more music than I normally have for this kind of gig. I think there's 16 accompaniments. And I know that in the past I would stress over, I've got a month and I have, 10 accompaniments. And that would freak me out. But I didn't really get to start like working on this until I was about 3 weeks out. And it's like the 16 accompaniments. And I'm just like, yeah, okay, this is going to work out. And a big part of that's because, my sight reading's better. And when your sight reading's better, you start way ahead. You get to start the race way further in. I don't know. I think I've made this baseball analogy. I should not ever make sports analogies because I don't know what I'm talking about. But it's like you're starting on second or third base. If your sight reading's good, that first read, man, you are just starting, having almost rounded the bases, and then it's just finishing up. So yeah, that's kind of what's great about that is I started so much further along. A huge part of that also, I've actually been scripting something, not rambly, about the different bottlenecks in sight reading, and one of those really is it's the proprioception thing. Being able to not have to look at my hands and being able to keep my eyes on the page more means that, yeah, I can read so much faster, and that means I'm starting closer to the home base, and I just learn so much faster. But that's because I'm investing in those skills. Now, as a professional, that's absolutely been necessary for me because from the professional standpoint, I tend to tell people like the more of those skills you have, and especially if you have a broader skill set, not just very classical skills, but if you have the ability to comp in different styles and play in jazz styles, and you have kind of this rounded understanding of music, you can take so many more jobs because of that. But then it's also like, how good are you at the things that you can do? Like, how quickly can you just put those into action? So like with piano, how quickly you can sight read really has a lot to do with like how many jobs can you take simultaneously and prepare them in time. Because it's not just the scheduling where you would be afraid to schedule things on the same day on top of each other. It's more about like the preparation time. Do you have enough time to prepare all of this music? And like this coming weekend is going to be nuts because I have like a busy Sunday, and then I got this concert and rehearsals on Monday, and then I've got a big thing on Tuesday with like 10 other pieces of music. That's a mix of instruments and singing and looping and craziness. So it's just, but having more of the skills so that you can just apply them instantly means you can take on this amount of work. And as a professional, you need to be able to take that on to make any decent amount of money. But, I argue the same thing for hobbyists. I think that there is value in that for a hobbyist because I think a lot of hobbyists, they do want the instant gratification of like, I've learned this really hard song and it sounds really cool, but a lot of times they're not walking away from that with anything. They didn't fully grasp what was happening. They couldn't tell you theory-wise what was going on. Usually by the end, they may have like memorized that it's all in their fingers, not really in their brain. So they didn't reinforce any reading skills. They just really haven't grasped anything. They might have played certain things, chord shapes or whatever, in that piece. They might have, done some jumping arpeggios and not realized, what those were. It's like, oh, I'm just playing through all these different inversions of the C major arpeggio. And when you understand it that way, then you understand how to immediately apply it everywhere else that you see it. But a lot of times they don't get that because they just didn't have that level of digestion. So they walk away, and every new piece is this giant hill they have to climb. And while it's intoxicating at first to get that excitement of like, I did this thing and it only took 3 months, like it gets so tiring at the end, and you're just like, you don't feel like going through the slog of learning another piece at that pace, that super slow pace. And also the reality is like nobody cares, like nobody wants to hear, especially your classical music, which I mean, it's sad, but it's kind of true. So, that's why I always tell people like work on the skills, because then the skills let you just sit down and play. And especially as you get older, you want to be able to just sit down and play, just sit down and do something. And as much as I'm a fan of sight reading, and I do think that it's probably one of the most useful skills because it gives you access to more resources, which makes learning all the other skills easier. But it's not that I'm an absolutist. I know a lot of classical people are. They're like, if you're not reading, it's not real music. But no, like if you're playing by ear, if that's the skill and you can just sit down and do that, that's great. If you can just sit down and comp, if you can pick out a fake book and just go, all of those are like totally valid ways to approach that. But just like work on a skill that's going to let you just sit down and play. Improvisation, things like that, because that's things that you can just keep doing and you don't have to have the maintenance. Like with my horn, I cannot pick up my horn right now and play anything reasonable for you. Like I could play badly and at potential of risk because I'm using, bad technique to make up for the fact that I don't have the musculature in place, and the tone would be terrible. And that sucks. But one of the great things particularly about piano is that it doesn't have that barrier. I can take, weeks off the piano. I rarely get to do that, but I could take weeks off the piano and just sit down and play. And I'm just like, there's no physical impediments like there is with a guitar or anything like that. My wife plays woodwinds, and flute has a little bit of that there's musculature issues that are the same thing. And the embouchure is the word for that. Your mouth muscles. And oboe has that. But like when she needs to pick up and play like a saxophone or a clarinet, single reed instruments, the bar is so low that like she could have not touched a saxophone for 6 months and be told, hey, you've got a 3-hour gig in 2 days. And she's like, yeah, cool, whatever. And she'll show up and she'll play that. There's no need to keep all of that maintained. And piano is so much like that. Like you don't have to keep all of that maintained. But think about the people who learn songs, big, difficult pieces of repertoire, totally in their fingers through this like finger memory process. And if they take a day off of just maintenance on that piece of music, it's gone. If they take 2 weeks off, man, it is really gone. Like they would have to do so much cleaning up. And since they probably don't have the good reading skills and all the comprehension things about what's happening in the music, redigesting that music and redecoding it to learn would be so much effort for them. But if you've got those skills, if you understand what you're playing, if you have learned your scales, like I could not play my scales now as good as I had mentioned in that video, like all of them 3 times up and down in like 3 minutes. Like I couldn't play that tempo now, but I don't need to. And that was kind of my point in that video, is how unimportant it is to maintain that. But yeah, like if you've got the basic skills, you can always get all that stuff back really, really fast. You can just sit down and play. I took a ridiculous amount of time off of playing ocarina, and then I had to pick it up for a gig. And it's just like, oh yeah, like literally riding a bicycle level of like, there's no physical impediments for ocarina, and like, okay, my technical facility isn't like super tight like it was, but it's like, oh, I got this back quickly and I'm improvising on it and reading on it, no problem. Because those skills stick. That's the stuff that sticks. And the thing that's crazy about trumpet is, I think at this point it may have been 2 or 3 years since I have played a trumpet gig. And yet still, with 2 weeks away, I'm just like, yeah, this is going to be fine. Well, once my throat's feeling better and all this, I'll pick up my horn and we'll work on it. It'll get there. because I know how to get there. And that's, I guess that's the important point that I'm making, is that when you have those skills, they just come back really fast. You don't forget that immediately. The way that you forget pieces of music, if you focus on just a couple of pieces of music and you leave them and you need to go on vacation and you come back, your entire repertoire is gone because you just don't have anything else. There's nothing else that ties you to being able to play the instrument in a decent way. So yeah, just rambling about some of the thoughts in my head about why the skill focus is so important over individual songs. Yes, apply it to those songs, but like that's the lens you want to read it through, is that you're learning those skills, you're investing in those skills, you're noticing your weaknesses in the pieces of music you're learning so that you can take those away, turn them into exercises, and focus on those skills. Just fix all of your weaknesses. But as long as you're like digesting all of that, then you're always just constantly applying those skills forward to every new piece you learn. So you're learning more music, but you're just applying skills, and you just realize how that works. And each piece is not an island. It's just a combination of different skills that you already pretty much have under your fingers. So yeah, I just think that's where the investment should be. That was just kind of on my mind because it was just interesting thinking about it this morning, how not anxious I am about this upcoming trumpet gig, despite having gotten sick when I was about to start prepping for it. And like, this put me behind and it doesn't make me nervous. And there have been times if I'd gotten sick for like piano or organ, yeah, it's making me really nervous because I'm behind on my practice schedule by a lot. And I'm not at a technical level where I can do that. Luckily, more these days, that's not as much of an issue. But, you know, I guess I've just been everywhere on the spectrum in my adult life, in my professional life. And so I really see that value, and I keep moving up on that. You know, I get closer and closer with piano all the time where it's just like, oh, this doesn't stress me out. I remember when I was first taking organ gigs, holy crap. Like, you know, I would need the music just like several weeks out, and it would just be brutal practice to get there because I didn't have all the technical facility yet. So when that happens, I have to put in this really inefficient practice where I'm just absolutely trying to beat it into my hands and, you know, feet for organ. And it is that sort of muscle memory situation that is not sustainable, and it's not an efficient way to practice, but I've had to do that. I even had to do that the first time I took a church gig. I was asked to sub somewhere, and it wasn't that much music, and it was some hymns, like whatever. And I wanted the music 3 weeks out because it terrified me, and I still struggled. I also didn't practice as efficiently back then, but I struggled. And like, you know, it got up to where, okay, I got better at it. At some point I took an interim gig and I had to start prepping every week. And that was hard. That was really, I was managing, but I was barely hanging on all the time. I'm taking another interim right now. And like, I don't know, I'm not sweating it that much because, you know, I'm just better off if somebody throws me a curveball. It's not as big of a deal. Back in the past when I had taken an interim, if somebody had thrown me a curveball, you know, and it's like 2 or 3 days out and they're like, oh, we need to change one of the hymns, I'd be like, oh my God, I can't do that. And especially if it was the morning of, I'd kind of shit my pants. But now, like, that's fine. You know, you want to change something a couple of days out, that's really fine. If you want to change it the morning of, yeah, I'll make it work. Like, I'm not going to have a panic attack. That's great. That peace of mind is incredible. And like, I really value that because I remember really freaking out about that kind of stuff. And, you know, it's also interesting because all the different instruments I play are on a different level on that spectrum. And so it really just gives me this perspective of like, yeah, okay, like I see how important the investments I've made are, and I can really see which ones matter. And man, I keep trying to end this. I'm doing a bad job of it. But no, one of the things that I'll mention is that I was practicing a lot of guitar this summer. I'd mentioned that. More classical style guitar. And there's so much of it where it's like, this doesn't really apply. like this doesn't apply that much. I don't see, even as somebody who understands musically what's going on, a lot of times I'm practicing on technical stuff and I'm like, I know this is good for me, but I don't see the direct application of it. And then, some of the gigs start rolling in where I need to be using more guitar skills. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is great that I figured this out. Like, why was I, whatever, I actually remember a very specific example for anybody who plays guitar. This was actually years back when I had this revelation, but it gives you kind of an example of the kind of thing that happens when you just learn some basics. So I had been working more and more on movable chords, bar chords off of the 5th and 6th string. And I'll say that, like, in the past, if I needed a B minor chord, oh my God, I could not get a B minor chord. I could only play like all the open cowboy chords. And so if I needed to get from like G to B, I'm doing, this G up here and then I'm jumping over this bar chord. It's not a terrible jump or anything. But then at some point I learned, oh yeah, well, I can just do that G bar chord and then I can just slip down and the B minor is right there, like, duh, like that's it wasn't easier because I hadn't practiced it as much. I'd gotten good at doing the less efficient one probably, but like now I have more options. And like, I didn't realize that very specific application of learning all these bar chords up and down the neck in these different positions. But then suddenly later it's like, oh, I get really practical uses for them when I'm in a situation where I have to use them. And that happens all the time with piano. All the time I'll be working on stuff and I'll like catch that something got better later. The sight reading stuff, when I was doing, whenever I get big breaks, I like to do a lot of sight reading and focus on it, really, especially leaning on the proprioception. And the thing is, day to day, you don't feel that much progress. It feels very stagnant because it's so incremental. Like, you don't feel like you're making strides, especially with sight reading. But I was really making a point of like trying to feel it out, and I would read way slower than I needed to specifically so I could keep my eyes on the page. And then, jump to months later and I'm working on this accompaniment gig I've got coming up, and there were a whole lot more large left-hand jumps. And these are things that I know in the past have given me trouble. Actually, one of the accompaniments was one I had played in the past, and I was struggling even looking up and down to play this particular thing. But I just like sight read through it effortlessly. I had no problem. A whole bunch of these others I hadn't read had big jumps, and I'm just like, okay, like my hand just knows where that's at. I don't have to freak out about where our hands are. And it's like, what a revelation that is, and how much easier that makes it. But it's because I wasn't working on a specific piece. I was working on my sight reading daily for kind of an extended period of time. Really, putting in about 30 minutes a day, really, really grinding out the proprioception, which is my big weakness. So sometimes you work on that and you don't even really notice it until later, where it pays off and it's amazing. And then there are other times where you start to, you can do it the other way. Now I will say that working on thirds and sixths, which I mentioned in the scales video, that's one of those things where once I started working on those, it was a combination, because in the past I literally just struggled with scales and sixths. They were a problem. Thirds and sixths, they were a problem for me in some places. If it's just a couple of them in a row, like, that's no big deal. That's no issue. But if I need to like go up a whole scale, that's a mess. And with my sixths, I would just do 1 and 5 all the way up the keyboard, however long. And it wasn't a problem because depending on what you're doing with the pedal, you can get away with it. But then I decided, I really do need to work on these the proper way, with good fingerings. And then later I'm playing music and I realize, oh wow, these make this so much easier. I'm not kind of stressing about like, how many fingers do I have left and what do I do to finger through this weird thirds passage? Because I just worked on that stuff, and like suddenly it made it the application was just, yeah. So yeah, but you could totally go the other way, where then you see those issues like, still those things aren't 100% for me. So I see the thirds and sixths and I'm struggling. I'm like, okay, I need to make that, a priority in my technical work. For me still, it's octave things are, especially in my right hand, are a struggle. And, I need to find more practice time. That is the problem. I'm talking about focusing on skills, not songs. I'm stuck in that awful place, as a career musician where I don't have the extra practice time in the day. I'm barely having enough practice time to cover all the music I need to prep, especially this week. But it's really hard to find the prep time to do specific work that you need to do. I'm not finding the time to practice sight reading. Yeah, sure, I'm actively reading everything I'm playing, keeping my eyes on the page, but that's not quite the same thing as reading fresh material. Like, your brain has to work in a different way to make that happen. But yeah, I wish I had more time to work on the octaves, and really I should probably just be trying to find 5 minutes a day to do a little bit of octave work. But yeah, you can totally start to recognize that's a good thing, is being able to, once you start applying certain skills forward and you realize, oh, all this music is just arpeggios, or like, oh, I'm just putting my hand in this specific chord shape and then I'm arpeggiating around or whatever. You'll notice that in a ton of music. Once you start seeing those patterns, then you start it makes it easier to realize which patterns you don't have down, what things you need to learn, and then wrap it around going the other way so you can make an exercise out of it to learn. But no, don't avoid learning the fundamental things that everybody already recommends, like scales and arpeggios, because even if they don't seem totally applicable right now, they might be. And I would say just constantly seek out things that are almost entirely technical in nature. Now, obviously, eventually you can kind of progress to a point where they don't have to be as dry. Scales are dry, arpeggios are dry. You still should learn them at up to a decent level. But once you've done that, then you can start putting exercises together. Like, oh gosh, okay. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't thinking about this. But let's say like you were working on your stride in your right hand. And like that's a thing that you kind of need to focus on, and that's hard. But once you've got that to a certain level, maybe you could start doing reinforcing an exercise like this, where you're just doing your walking through inversions of block chords in your right hand, right? And now you can play those together, and you're actually playing something kind of musical. And especially if you go through a progression like that, now you have a musical exercise where you are reinforcing a lot of good technique. And it makes it easier. And, eventually try to not look at your hands, which, let's see how well I can do that. Not quite. I didn't quite find the G. Anyway, still working on stride, especially if I'm doing full octaves on the bottom. That's a little harder than just doing anyway. So, but yeah, you can do those things and start chaining together technical exercises from both hands into coherent musical ideas to practice them. And they're technical exercises, but they still don't sound like garbage. I've talked about plenty with just like chord progressions. If you just want to like roll in your left hand, just doing like 1, 5, 6, 4, and you just want to practice that, and then just playing different block chords in your right hand. And then you can play with, well, how many places can I walk around? What if I want to just voice the chord? I should totally make another video about this. What am I doing? You could work on voice leading. What if I just try to ascend? What's the nearest voicing I can ascend to? And then just keep ascending. I descended a little bit there, but then you can totally walk it back down and be like, okay, now I'm going to do the descending version of that. And that makes you think about those voicings. And you have to think about what's the nearest voicing that keeps me moving up or down. So you get really good at voicing in whatever direction. So that's just an example of that. And that's just doing 1, 5, 1 in your left hand. What if you had trouble with 1, 5, 3, which was always a problem for me? You could just do the same thing and chain those together. Sorry, I'm not going to the 5 chord or the 5, 7. Not quite nailing it there. Or, other patterns which I've mentioned before. where you walk through the 2 or the 9. I mean, that's just an exercise. It's a technical exercise. It could be pretty music, and you could make it more interesting. More interesting if you want. It's easier if you're not talking. You know, that kind of stuff where that is getting borderline into like how you practice improvisation. You've practiced all of those patterns and your hands are used to already doing those things. And then you sort of, during the practice, you're very focused on, I'm doing this very specific thing. I'm going to I'm walking through these chord inversions, or I'm, whatever, making this pattern, make that pattern, that kind of thing. Sorry. And just intentionally make yourself do that for each of your chords. Then that just becomes a thing that like later when you're improvising, you kind of like your inner ear kind of hears that ahead of time, that's what you want to do. And your hands already know what to do. Yeah, here I am without a script. I tried to end this video probably 10 minutes ago. Okay, focus on skills, not songs. You can see the benefits. It's amazing. I'm going to go now. Definitely need to rest my voice. Thanks.